Baruch Hashem, it's a tremendous chus and a privilege to be able to give this year. And really, it's one of the most fundamental, basic aspects of the topics of shiurim that we can give. The fundamentals of Yiddishkeit itself, of our Emunah in Judaism and Yiddishkeit. And I owe a tremendous debt of Akar Satov to Ani Maamin Foundation for making this possible, led by Rabbi David Saperman, as well as Rabbi Moshe Pogrom, and it's really an amazing organization. At the end, we're going to give out MP3s to every person here with about 14 shiurim that you guys can listen to, and we'll be in touch with you through email and phone. We'll sign you up. They have like a nice newsletter that has like an interesting tidbit of scientific fact and stuff like that each week. But also we're going to potentially over the course of the summer have different types of quizzes for financial compensation that you can take over the summer as an incentive to listen to the shiurim and to incorporate the knowledge that Rabbi Saperman gives over so beautifully. Okay, so this shiur is about Emunah. By way of introduction, every question that you can come up with in this topic and really any topic in life is good. And there are answers to your questions. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, I'm not going to be stopping in the middle for questions, but there is a pen and papers around. Please write down questions. Don't forget them and ask them. There'll be time for questions and answers at the end. The questions and answers are amazingly valuable. No one should leave here with any question left unanswered. As well as anybody that might be watching this video presentation, if you have a question, my email address is landa, Landa 1793 at gmail.com, landa1793 at gmail.com. You can always write me an email, and you can also communicate through Ani Maamin Foundation at animaamin.org. There are really three pillars upon which our Emunah, from a rational perspective, is built. Number one, that there is a God, a supernatural being in a supernatural realm who created the world. And he continues to orchestrate the events of the world. Number two, that there is a Torah shebichsav, a written Torah, that he wrote, he authored word by word. Moshe Rabbeinu actually wrote it, but he authored each and every word. And number three, that there was an oral Torah that again Hashem dictated through Moshe to Bnei Yisrael, a Torah Sheba'al Peh. Once we have those three pillars established, really everything we do, we can trace its roots back to those three pillars. Now, it must be said that many people have what we might call Emunah Pshuta, but let's be clear about what that means. Emunah Pshuta does not mean to be thoughtless. It doesn't mean that you just don't think about things and therefore simplistically you'll just accept. It means that when you look around and you receive the Mesorah from the previous generation, it's so obvious. You see through the Niflaos HaBoreh how obvious the truth of Judaism is. And therefore you have no questions. And that's something that I really want to stress. That while some people will have questions and some people won't, either way, understanding and getting a more thorough understanding of the credibility in our Emunah is so valuable, certainly for those who have the questions, but also for those who don't. It could be mechazik the Emunah on many levels. Matan Torah really is the basis for our Emunah. We're going to start earlier than Matan Torah, but Matan Torah itself, at Maimon Har Sinai, when we got the Torah, that revelation, which we'll discuss at length soon, is something that really put within us a tremendous sense of Emunah. As Rabbi Saperman says, Da masha tashav la'apikoros, know how to answer the apikoros, can actually apply to ourselves as well. And that is actually the MP3 that I'm going to be giving out at the end. Know what to answer to yourself. It can be mechazik the Emunah for everyone. This seichel approach has many makoros to it. And like I said, it's really for all, especially for those who struggle with questions, but just as much for those who don't, to be mechazik the Emunah. So let's start in the beginning. We all know innately It might be obvious to some of us. We all know that we received the Torah at Har Sinai, and in the Torah, right at the beginning, it tells us how the world was created. Bereshis bara Elokim. We'll see soon that that third word is really the hardest word of the pasuk for much of the world. But Bereshis bara Elokim, Hashem created everything. What would be any alternative to that? That could make sense. For thousands of years, it's fascinating to note, the only alternative to that was that the world always existed. All the great philosophers from all time believed, if they didn't believe in God creating the world, that the world just simply always existed. That was the only alternative for thousands of years. Then came the year 1929, and subsequently 1964, and the entire intellectual community, the entire scientific community accepted as pretty much a scientific fact that there was a creation to the world, that there was a beginning to the world. How did they come to that? In 1929, Hubble developed a telescope powerful enough to detect phenomena in the outer regions of space. We're not going to get into the technicalities of that, but we can talk about it afterwards if you'd like. In which through that he understood that the universe is expanding over time. It's getting bigger. And so if we just take a simple step of logic, if the universe is expanding over time, then if we go back in time and further back in time and further back in time, we come to a singular point from which everything had to have come from. And that was a tremendous chiddush. That was a tremendous new ideology. That it's not like they thought as the only alternative to God creating the world has now been debunked, and it was accepted for thousands of years. That in of itself is an interesting point to ponder. In addition, they found microwaves that they believed to be the echoes, so to speak. This is complex science, but just to mention it, in 1964, in fact, Rabbi Dr. Chaim Presby actually worked in Bell Labs. He has patents on fiber optics, which are all over the place now. And he worked with those pioneers discovering those microwaves. He actually has a couple of shiurim that are fantastic. Torah Masorah on their website has a Ve'emunah Balelos program that is a fantastic set of videos, really pretty much going through everything that we're going to go through here today, but a whole bunch of an expanse of different videos from different speakers. And so in the video there, he discusses the evolution of how that discovery came to be when he was working in Bell Labs. It's quite interesting. So what are we left with? What we're left with is this idea, the Big Bang, just a way to talk about the beginning. Somehow it began, and then evolution allows it to take its course. This is what's left for those to hold on to deny intelligent design, as the scientific community might call it, that God created the world, Bereshis bara Elokim. They are left simply grasping for what they can grasp at. So this idea of the Big Bang started with this first particle the scientists call singularity, that first single, let's call it intense particle that had the potential for the entire universe unbelievably intensely packed within it. What's the most obvious question that you'd ask once we come back to that first particle? How did it get there? And that's still a question that they're working on. The laws of science itself seem to make it impossible to understand how something could come from nothing. Yesh me'ayin, we have the laws of conservation of matter and energy. That means that nothing can come, as we would call it in Chazal, yesh me'ayin. Something from nothing. So how did that first particle get there? And this is a question that they have not answered. They're working on it. But the laws of science itself seem to make it impossible to ever answer that question. In fact, I once heard Rabbi Heinemann give the following mashal to discuss, well, to what extent have they answered this question, how did the world begin, if you don't want to say God created the world, the truth. He says, imagine if you have a basketball spinning in the air, and you're wondering, what's keeping that basketball spinning there in midair? And there's a curtain right underneath the bottom of the basketball, so you can't see what's holding it up. So you tell your friend, well, show me what's underneath that curtain. And he pulls the curtain down a little bit, and he sees a big finger balancing that basketball, spinning on his finger. Okay, what's holding up that finger? So he lowers the curtain more. And he sees a big basketball player holding up that basketball with his finger, spinning on his finger. Well, what's holding up the basketball? So you lower the curtain more. And then there's this tremendous elephant that the basketball player is balancing on top of. And the elephant, what's holding that up? Well, there are two donkeys holding up each side of the elephant. And what's holding up the donkeys? There's this big marble pillar that the two donkeys are. And then the person says, okay, I get it. Now I understand how the basketball is spinning. You do? If you don't ask me to go to the next step, you don't understand anything. You have a big mass of pillars and donkeys and elephants and basketball players and then a ball floating in midair until you reveal what's on the ground, till you get to the end. So long as you don't get to the end, it's not that you've answered the question 90%. You haven't answered the question at all. It just opens up the question larger to, well, what's making this entire mass float? And so too here. If we can't answer how that first particle got there, then even if we attempt, which there are many gaps as we'll see, but even if we attempt to explain how things can transform from one thing to the next, become more complex over years and years, still, if we can't answer how that first particle got there, we have not answered the question at all. And that's an important point to consider. In addition, another question that is just as an important question to ask is that the laws of science would seem to dictate that something needs to be there to cause it to react. How did that singular particle all of a sudden explode, so to speak, and from there the universe was created and continues to expand to this day? What caused it to react? It would seem that these are impossible questions at this point for us to be able to answer. And so I ask you the following question. What is the more open-minded and the more closed-minded approach to these questions? Think about it. I have two possibilities in front of me. That there is no supernatural realm. There is no realm that is not bound by biology, chemistry, physics. I'm closed-minded to that option. My only option is that everything exists and that ever existed is within the physical, natural realm, bound by the sciences. My other option is that there's a supernatural realm. That there's a realm that we cannot detect with our devices, and it exists out there. Now, do we ever have realms of existence that we were not able to detect with our devices? And only over time did we develop the technology? Of course. Think about it. Anything microscopic was undetectable for who knows how long, and then only recently did they begin to be able to detect a whole realm of existence that we didn't know existed until we developed the right tools. Now, maybe by definition, the supernatural realm is a realm that we can never develop the tools to detect within our natural world. By definition, it is above nature, beyond our grasp, but so what? Who says it doesn't exist? And if we don't assume it exists, if we assume the possibility that it could exist, perhaps it exists, all of a sudden these questions go away. These questions lend themselves as tremendous evidence for the fact that there is a supernatural realm with a supernatural being, namely God, who came from a supernatural realm that always existed and created the world, began the natural realm from a point in time, began time itself. Now you might ask, okay, so I don't know how the natural world began. But what do you say, Rabbi? What's your answer? That God created it? Do you understand God? Do you know God? Do you know how He works? Do you know who He is? Do you know what He's like? And I say, no, I don't know to all those questions. I don't really know. I can't really understand. He's in the supernatural realm, beyond my comprehension. So how do we deal with that question? When a person walks out into the world, as we find with Avram Avinu, he's struck by a question. Any thinking person is struck by, how did this all come to be? Look at the beauty, look at the complexity. Here I am, I'm aware of my existence. How did it all come to be? That is a question that we as natural beings ask about the natural world. It is an automatic question that burns within the inside of most people just thinking about, how did it all come to me? Baruch Shem, us who stood at Har Sinai and we have the Torah and we have our Masorah, the question is a non-starter. But any human being without any Masorah ponders that question as they've done for thousands of years. What these questions motivate us towards, what they push us towards, is the recognition that there is a supernatural realm beyond our comprehension. Whereas to be closed-minded and to assume there's only a natural realm leaves us with seemingly unanswerable questions, as we said. And so, the question on the table is not, okay, now that we assume that there's a supernatural realm and we have credibility for that, how did that supernatural realm come to be? By definition, it's something that's beyond our grasp, beyond our comprehension. All we're saying is that the question on the table is, how did the natural world get here? And we are natural beings. That's our question. The answer to that question is there must be something beyond the natural. To then ask, but how did that beyond get there? That's impossible for us to understand. It's beyond our comprehension. But it is not at all the same question as how did this physical natural world get here, and to be left with seemingly unanswerable questions. So really, the open-mindedness of, let's call it the religious person here in the room, to consider and then see the evidence for that supernatural realm is actually has tremendous credibility due to these questions versus being closed-minded and assuming as a starting point, no, there is no supernatural realm. That's the first step. That's all just talking about how did everything begin, the beginning. Now, how did everything develop into the unbelievable complexities that we have today? So again, this is an impossible question to answer for anyone before Darwin came along. Because before he came along and suggested his theory of evolution, which we're going to get into in a second, how could you ever answer this question? The only answer was, which was debunked, that the world just always existed the way that it was. Thousands, millions, however back you want to go, however many years you want to go back, that's the way that the world existed. But now we see that that's wrong. We've absolutely proven that that's wrong. So Darwin comes in and he presents us with a theory of evolution. We're not going to go into too many details. We don't have enough time to get into too many details, but we'll go through a little bit, and I'll recommend some resources to get into a lot of information that you can get into on this topic. First of all, the scientists themselves that buy into Darwinian evolution recognize the statistical improbability of it being able to occur. The amount, basically what evolution says is that random accidents happen from time to time. Random genetic mutations happen from time to time, and those that provide an advantage for the person, the animal, the creature, the organism, the planet, those are the things that are going to stick and continue to be passed down to future generations, and you can have an evolution of a species and from one species to the next. That's the basic theory, survival of the fittest. But there are so many accidents that have to happen, and so many of them in order, and some of them simultaneously, in order for us to have what we have in our world today, that even with the 14 billion years that scientists would like to suggest is the age of the universe, even with it, it is extremely difficult statistically, mathematically, statistically. And so right from the start, you start with the fact that why would we even accept this, except for it is currently the only alternative to the obvious recognition. The Emuna Pshuta, you look around, the Ribono Shalom, God created the world. There is a supernatural realm that always existed, is not bound by time or space, and from it, the natural world began, was created. Think about it. Imagine if you were walking through the desert, and you come across a watch, famous mashal, and you pick up the watch, it says Swiss made on the back, and you're walking with your friend, and your friend says to you, where do you think that watch came from? And you say, I guess somebody was walking through the desert in the same area that we are, and he dropped his watch. So your friend says, no, that's not what happened. I think what happened is there was a tremendous hurricane in Switzerland, and tornadoes struck the watch factory, and the parts from the watch flew up into the atmosphere, and lightning struck it, and they fused together. They formed a watch. The hurricane winds in the atmosphere carried them over here to the desert. It fell down from the sky, and here you have this watch that was created by the hurricanes and tornadoes. You look at him like, What happened to you? That's ridiculous. That makes no sense at all. You wouldn't even consider it as a possibility. That is of the likes of what we were talking about when it comes to these ideas, these theories. Similarly, imagine if I got a check from one of you, and I went to cash it in the bank, and you ran up to me and you said, "Whoa, that's a fake check. Where'd you get that from? That's not my signature." I said, "It says $500 written to Rabbi Landa, and it has your signature on it." Rabbi Saperman brings this mushal all the time. Imagine if I say, you come to me and you say, no, that's not what happened. What happened, I saw it happen. What happened is that on my desk I have old-fashioned ink, a wet ink. The ink spilled over the check, and it landed perfectly to create my signature, $500. It wrote out the words, $500. Everything got written out perfectly on the check, but I never wrote it. Give it back. Imagine we went to court and we presented the case to the judge. It would be thrown out in a second. It's ridiculous. That is of the likes of what we were discussing here as an alternative to the most obvious idea that there is a God from the supernatural realm who created all of the natural. Look at the wonders of the body itself. Just a couple of quick examples. We have eyebrows. Why do we have eyebrows? What's the purpose of eyebrows? So when I give this shiur in different classes, usually people get that the eyebrows are there so that when you sweat, the sweat is caught in the eyebrow and pushed to the sides of your face. It doesn't go in your eyes, so it prevents the sweat from getting in your eyes. Now let's imagine how that would look when it comes to an evolutionary perspective. So there's one warrior who faces up another warrior. Now one warrior has this genetic mutation. He's a freak with eyebrows. Everyone before him didn't have eyebrows. Okay. So they're about to battle each other. But consistently every time, the one with eyebrows wins. You know why? Because that other guy, he was doomed from the start. Because when he started to sweat, the sweat was getting in his eyes too much. Really? Really? That's going to enhance his battling skills so much that there's going to be a survival of the fittest to promote throughout the generation eyebrows? Very hard to understand. The eye itself has so many complex components to it. Every one of them has to work together. If you would just have the eyeball without the nervous system behind it and without the region in the brain to process the visual imagery, you'd have nothing. And if you have any one of those parts, you'd have nothing. So are we to understand that all the parts simultaneously evolved as random mutations in an organism, in a being, and that provided him this advantage of survival of the fittest? Because it's not just enough for one accident, we need all those accidents to come at once. The statistics are astounding, and these are just tiny, tiny examples, drops in the bucket. In fact, some used to like to bring the proof from vestigial organs, parts of the body that seem to make no sense, they seem to be superfluous. If an infinite being, God, created the human body, created man, why would there be any parts of the body that don't make sense? So it must be that there's no God, they would argue. But we've seen that those vestigial organs, time and time again, actually now we've discovered with the advancement of technology, have tremendous significance. They used to think the pituitary gland was a vestigial organ. It is one of the master glands of hormones in the brain for the whole body to operate properly. How about tonsils? How many people in this room, by a raise of hand, had their tonsils removed? Nobody. This is the first time I'm giving this year, and it's nobody. Usually it's one or two. But if you go back to your parents' generation, and I'd be asking them, how many people when you were kids, when you were teenagers, in your class had their tonsils removed? You'd have 30%, sometimes 70%, a tremendously high percentage that had their tonsils removed because they didn't understand what the purpose was for. Now they're understanding more and more that it's not so simple to remove the tonsils whenever there's an infection, because there's rhyme and reason and purpose everywhere we look, from our bodies to the universe. And as I write over here, see Rabbi Avigdor Miller's book, The Universe Testifies, and especially Rabbi David Saperman, Emuna, a refresher course, is an amazing sefer. You can buy that book. It's an English book. And as well as in his audio series, Know What to Answer to Yourself, which I'm going to be giving out at the end, you'll be able to hear a lot more about that. A couple more quick points on this. It's important to know the difference between macroevolution and microevolution. Microevolution is what Darwin used to prove his theory of macroevolution. Microevolution is something we do see in nature. Butterflies that will be better suited if their colors are lighter than darker or darker than lighter, will adapt with genetic mutations over time. That's microevolution. Micro meaning small scale, meaning that the butterfly itself is not going to turn into a new animal, a new creature, which we've never recorded in the history of human recorded history, anything like that happening. That it will adapt to its surroundings but remain the same creature is microevolution. We have evidence for that, and we have actual happenstance of that. However, macroevolution, that one species can change so dramatically that it turns into another species, we have zero evidence for. And that's the gap that Darwin was trying to close, and he never succeeded in closing. He was using microevolutionary examples to try to prove macroevolution. Important not to get confused by those two examples. On this point, I'll end off with a famous, funny story with Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. He was on the plane with his son, Rabbi Avram, and there was a government minister on the plane near him, and he was asking Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, I don't understand something. My kids, they bring me to the airport, they drop me off, they pop the trunk, have a nice trip. But you look at your son, it's unbelievable how he serves you. He's constantly getting up and asking you, do you need more? Do you need anything? Can I get you anything? What's the difference? I'm a respected person in my profession, and you're respected in your profession. What's the difference? And Rabbi Yaakov answered, my kids look at me, the previous generation, and the generation before me. They see me and the previous generations as one generation closer to Har Sinai, to Maimon Har Sinai, to what started it all for Klal Yisrael, what made us into a nation, where God himself revealed himself. That's what they see, closer and closer to Sinai. But you who believe in evolution, your kids see you as one step closer to, right. So, what do you expect? The respect that you should have for your elders is much less apparent because, after all, they're simply one step closer to the monkeys from who they would say that we came. Okay, let's jump in now to the real meat and potatoes of this year. Really, until now, we were discussing something that's like the icing on the cake. It's sweet, it's nice, and I think it has tremendous credibility to it. But really, the core of our Emunah, as the Ramban says in multiple places, is Maimon Har Sinai. The Psukim themselves explicitly talk about how we ourselves, Klal Yisrael by the mountain, approximately 2 million, maybe plus people, themselves experienced the Ribbono Shel Olam speaking to them. They themselves witnessed that there is a God and that he was giving us the Torah through Moshe Rabbeinu and that he chose Moshe Rabbeinu as the prophet through which to give it to. That is the testimony of the entire nation standing by that mountain, written into the words of the Torah itself. Think about the difference between how the other Western religions, for example, began and what their credibility relies on and ours. Yes, it's true. The Christian believes his father, who believes his father, etc., that there was a point in time that there was a man named Yashka, and he came and he did whatever he did, and he started the religion, or his disciples started the religion. Similarly for Islam, with Muhammad coming down and giving over the prophecy that he had. We're not going to get into those details, but the basic idea is one or an extremely small group of people came and decided to give over the prophecy. This is the new religion. This is the religion. So even if you have a billion people believing in something, if what they're believing in traces itself back to one man's claim, then it's not a billion strong, it's one strong. A billion people bought into it by this time, after generations. But it began with one man. What does it take for Christianity or Islam to be a lie? It takes one man to be lying, back then. What does it take for Judaism to be a lie? It takes all 2 million people making it up. It takes all of them lying to each other and then to the next generation, which Lawrence Kellerman, who studied, he has an excellent video online you can also see on the rational approach to Judaism, a lot of what we're saying, especially this part. He calls this the bomb of everything. He says, look at every other religion that ever crossed the face of the earth. And he studied comparative religions in college. He says there's no other religion that has that mass revelation story. So many witnesses to God himself choosing them as a nation and giving them the document, the Torah, in our case. Why? It gives us so much credibility. Why doesn't any other religion have that in their Masorah? And the answer is because you could never make that up. How do you ever make that up? Imagine if in this room right now I tell you, listen, God came to me in a dream last night and he told me that you guys should all pay taxes to me. I'm going to be your leader. And he chose me. So you could choose to believe me or not. I'm one person. I could be telling the truth or not, depending on my charisma, depending on if I'm instilling any fear into you, depending on if I'm offering you any incentive. You can choose to believe me, which were all components of how the other religions expanded themselves. But imagine if I came to you and I said, last night I was woken up by God. I was brought out to the park. I told God, look, you want to choose me, that's great, but let's bring all these guys together so we can have a nice olam, we can have a nice crowd witnessing you choosing me. And God says, I knew I chose you for a reason. Good idea. And he woke all of you up from your sleep last night and brought you to the park. You remember? And you were all there, and you saw God choosing me and giving us this document, which, by the way, says, pay me lots of money. Imagine I told you that. You'd look at me like I'm crazy. What? That definitely didn't happen, because while I don't know what happened to you, I know what did or didn't happen to me. And therefore, there's no way I'm going to accept it. It's so difficult to try to convince, nearly impossible to convince someone what happened to them. And that is the difference between Judaism and the other religions of the world. It is not about believing ultimately one person's claim. It is believing ultimately the nation's testimony, the mass revelation. One might say, well, maybe there was never a revelation and the whole idea was introduced at a later point in time in history. Maybe somebody came with this document, made it look old, and he introduced it to everyone sitting there in a tribal region somewhere. And he said, your ancestors were here. And they asked, but what happened? How come we don't have any memory of this? And he says, no, don't worry about it. His name was, let's say, John. And he says, don't worry about it. You forgot it. It was forgotten, but now I'm coming back to remind you all it was forgotten in the previous generations. There are so many questions on such a suggestion. First of all, when exactly would this have historically taken place? We know that the entire cultural world accepted that there was a biblical document called the Torah in the same fashion that it exists right now, as much as 2,300 years ago with the Septuagint, when you had all those 70 Zikanim coming together and translating the Torah into Greek, which was the modern cultured civilized language of the international world, like English is today. And so the world was aware of the Torah already at that, so it has to be before that. Now, Matan Torah was 3,300 years ago approximately. So there's that 1,000-year period. In that 1,000-year period, you have the Malachim, David HaMelech, Shlomo HaMelech, the Bayis Rishon, Bayis Sheni, which spans a good 800 years, 400 to 800 years after Matan Torah. So we have all these detailed records. When exactly would the Torah have been totally forgotten, that the people have no clue, and all of a sudden it's introduced at that point? There seems to be no place in history to actually put it in, just logistically to find the years to do it in. In addition, this guy John, how come we never heard of him? Our Masorah should not be that we all witnessed and experienced God himself at Har Sinai 3,300 years ago. Our Masorah should be 2,700 years ago, John came and introduced to us the religion that is Judaism, and he told us about how hundreds of years before that there was a Maimon Har Sinai. That's not what we have. There is no mention of such person. Lastly, there's much more to say, but lastly for now, in Dvarim, Parak Lamed Aleph, Pasuk Kaf Aleph, it says, Ki losi shachach mi pizaro. Is John an idiot? Why would John write in this document that he wants to try to convince the people to accept that this Torah, this religion, will never be forgotten from your children? His whole thesis is, it seems to have been forgotten, but here I'm reintroducing it to you. And he himself, in preparation for this trick, writes that it will never be forgotten. And there's so much more to say. For lack of time for now, we'll leave it at that, but the Maimon Har Sinai, the mass revelation, has such a credibility advantage to Judaism over the other religions. It is unbelievable. And really over any other possibility, even if you look at atheism, which is the most prevalent in our times and what's going on in the media and in our culture. Sociologically, as Lawrence Kellerman puts it, to be able to create out of thin air a mass revelation story is so impossible that it lends itself to tremendous credibility. As we discussed before, never in any other society, in any other religion, was it ever successfully implemented into their Masorah. By the way, if we're concerned about billions of people arguing with us, just keep in mind, those same billions, Christians and Muslims alike, all agree that there was a Maimad Har Sinai, that the Torah was given to us by the Ribono Shalom, to Judaism. It was given to us. They all agree. And even though in the Torah it says, and this Torah will never change, many times throughout the Torah, even though it says that, still, they'll suggest that over time it changed. Over time it changed. And how did it change? Well, initially it was introduced with this tremendous lightning and thunder and a mass revelation to millions of people. And then over time, God whispered to Yashka. He whispered, actually it's changing now. And then once again he whispered to Muhammad, Islam, it's changing. So all these whisperings are quite suspicious when he introduced the whole religion to begin with this tremendous boom in front of millions of people. Lastly, on this point, people sometimes wonder, but it's uncomfortable to believe that billions of people could be living the life of a lie. Is that possible? That billions of people could be living the life of a lie? Just uncomfortable. If we choose Judaism to be wrong, then it's not as many people. But if you choose one of the other Western religions, it's billions. How could it be? The numbers are just astounding. Well, guess what? Billions of people are living the life of a lie no matter how you slice it. Christianity and Islam are mutually exclusive to each other. They don't accept each other. The religious Christians will say that the religious Muslims are going to go to their version of Gehenna, and the Muslims to the Christians alike. So, if they're mutually exclusive, it is mathematically 100% that billions of people are living the life of a lie. There's no escaping that fact. Now, to say, well, it's better to say that 1 billion plus a number of millions are living the life of a lie and 1 billion are right, that's already just small numbers. Once we could accept that billions of people were led astray, billions of people are living the life of a lie, fact, no longer does that question have any teeth to it whatsoever. And in fact, we know, based on everything that we said, that Judaism is the true and correct religion. Now we have to establish the third and final pillar, the oral Torah, the Torah Shebaal Peh. Do we see in the Torah itself that there is a Torah Shebaal Peh? One place we see it is Shechita. The Torah says, do Shechita as I have commanded you, and there are Rishonim who clearly learn that means that Hashem gave over the instructions to Moshe Rabbeinu. Where? Nowhere in the Pesukim does it say any instructions how to shecht. Do you cut off which part of the body? How do you kill it? It doesn't say anywhere. It has to be that there is an oral Torah that accompanies the written Torah. It's clear in the words of the Torah itself. Furthermore, the vowels of the Torah are not written in the Torah. When you have ches, lamed, vez, that could be chalav, milk, or chalev, fat. Now the Torah tells us, don't eat chalev, don't eat fat. Imagine if we choose to read that as chalav, milk. Don't eat milk. Don't eat milk. And that would greatly impact our lives in a totally different way than chalev, fat, specific fat. So we have to know what the vowels are. They change the meaning of the words. And therefore, it has to be that there's an oral tradition, an oral set of instructions accompanying the written Torah for the pauses that can make contextual differences as well. And there are multiple areas of vagueness in the Torah where it's not clear. In the way that it's written, there has to be an oral Masorah, a Torah Shebaal Peh, accompanying the Torah Shebichsav. Furthermore, we have the Rambam in his introduction to the Yad HaChazaka, who goes through great Rabbanim from every single generation, going all the way back to Har Sinai. That means we have detailed historical records of the people going back to Har Sinai, the leaders of the generation. We see the chain of the Masorah, of the information of the Torah Shebaal Peh. Lastly, for this, Some people might ask, well, look at the game of telephone. If I start over here on this side of the table, and I whisper a sentence, and you pass it on and pass it on, we all know the game of telephone, it gets totally corrupted at the end. Totally corrupted. So don't you see, therefore, that when you pass it on over generations, surely it will get corrupted? And the answer to that is simple. Imagine if there was a fire on one end of the room and the phone was on the other end of the room. But the phone number for the fire department was where the fire was on one end of the room, the other end. So for some reason, let's just say theoretically, hypothetically, you needed to talk from person to person to person to person to person to get the number for the fire department to the person standing by the phone. Do you think that they'd mess up on that phone number? It could be 9, 10 digits long. It doesn't matter. That person's going to say to his neighbor, here's the phone number. Here it is, 443. And the guy's going to say to his friend, 1 second, let me just make sure the first 3 numbers were 443, right? Okay. They're going to double and triple check. And there's so much more than that going on when it comes to the Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh. But there's no way that they'd mess up that phone number when it's important. The reason the game of telephone corrupts information is because it's not important. It's a silly statement that starts it out. It's a game. But when it's not a game and it's life itself, you're not going to mess up. You're going to double and triple check, and you'll get the information accurately. There's for sure a whole shiur we could do that we're not going to do today on the Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh, understanding the evolution of machlokes and all of that, which is very interesting. But for now, we're here just to show there is clearly a Torah Sheba'al Peh that has the strength to be given over accurately in its main points from generation to generation. So if all of you were Christians sitting here, let's say, and you heard me giving my shiur, would you all take your crosses, throw them out the window, and I could have a neat stack of yarmulkes over here. You could all choose the style you like, and you'd all convert to Judaism based on my shiur. Would we be creating a revolution? First of all, they believe their fathers as we do. Now, we established a huge credibility advantage in the Masorah, that yeah, we believe our fathers, but it goes back to a mass revelation versus them going back to that one person. But as long as it's possible, they will hold on to their Masorah, and the reason is simple. There is a simple psychological phenomenon called cultural pressure. That means that when a person is in an environment where everyone believes that system, your parents, your teachers, your priest, most of all perhaps your football coach, everyone believes that Mahalach HaChaim, that philosophy, it is extremely difficult to break out of that. And so they remain within that understanding, that philosophy. As long as there's a possibility, even if that possibility is so remote and unlikely, we cannot prove, like I can prove that that table is sitting there with our 5 senses, that Judaism is right. But we can prove intellectually a huge credibility advantage for Judaism over any other option. And that's what we're here to establish today. In fact, people go so far as to say that maybe Maimon Har Sinai was really all of Klal Yisrael going on one big trip, one big hallucinogenic trip. And they consumed either peyote, which is a certain type of cactus, or mushrooms, as my Zeta called them in Europe, Meshuggah mushrooms, and they all hallucinated the same crazy mass revelation story. And that's how it happened. But you see to what lengths they're going. That makes no sense. A hallucination is not something that everyone shares. It's very personal. It depends on your personal experiences, your history, etc. It's not that everyone hallucinates together. That's not how hallucinations work, but we don't even have to get into it. As long as it's possible. But let me just make this point really clear. When we choose how to live our lives, yeah, we were born and brought up in Jewish homes, Baruch Hashem, in the right mahalach, in Jewish communities. So you'd say, well, it's hard for us to break out of it too. That's true. But if we step back for a second and look at the credibility advantage that we were born into, it's a tremendous chizuk to our Emunah. Yes, it would be hard for us to change even if we'd find credibility advantages in the other way, but there aren't. Look at it objectively. Ask the questions. We'll have time at the end. You will see clearly the credibility advantage is so strong for Judaism and its foundation. So Baruch Hashem, thank God that we were born into a place that it makes it easy for us to follow the path of truth. If I were to tell you that maybe this floor tile right here is a portal to another dimension, and I'm going to fall through never to return. So maybe I should skip that floor tile when I walk out of this room later. It certainly decreases the chances of me falling into that dimension. But you'd say that's ridiculous. And maybe the next tile too. So I should just skip as many tiles as possible. How about breathing? Is it possible poison gas came into this room right now? It's possible. It's extremely unlikely. But if I'd hold my breath right now, I would breathe a little bit. I would have less of a chance of breathing poison gas because I'm breathing less in general. Whatever the tiny fraction percentage that poison gas came into this room is, if I breathe less, I'm dividing it in half. I'm dividing it in 4. I'm lessening the chance. But we don't live our lives like that. We don't hold our breaths as much as possible to decrease such absurd chances because we live our lives based on ignoring such tiny remote possibilities. That is the likes of what we are dealing with. And if we live our lives when it comes to walking and breathing in that way, certainly we should live our lives when it comes to the basic philosophy and ideology that we base all of our lives and our existence on. I want to show you one quick video. I have 2 here, but I'll show you one quick video of how cultural pressure can affect how we behave and how we think, and therefore how difficult it would be, despite all this evidence and this credibility, as long as it's not absolutely 5 senses type of a proof, they will stick with this and their ideology. Let's take a look here.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. Here comes the candid camera staff, 3 of them at least. And this man has apparently been in groups before. Now, here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
All right, so you get the point over here. It's actually an insurance commercial. But you get the point over here that peer persuasion is quite powerful. There's another video here for the constraint of time. I'm not going to go through it, but basically there are many psychological studies done, like the second video shows, where they had a person sitting in a waiting room and they had smoke coming out from under the door on the side of the room. And when the person was all by themselves in the waiting room waiting for their appointment, they immediately got up and went and told the person, I think there's smoke here, there's danger, you got to figure out what's going on over here. But when there was a room filled with people, like 8 other people, who were in on it and were just ignoring like it was totally normal that there was tons of smoke piling into the corner of the room from another door, so then that person, most of the time, just sat there for 10, 20 minutes until they were called in for their appointment, because no one else is doing anything about it. We are affected greatly by our peers, and that's obviously a discussion that we can have from a psychological perspective at length, its own lecture. But again, that is something just to show how powerful it is. And so Baruch Hashem, for us, it actually works to our benefit, that it is something that enhances our living with Emunah and our living with the truth that is Judaism. Okay, we should be done here within 5 minutes. Just a couple final points here. History itself seems to be something which gives tremendous credibility to Yiddishkeit as well. The Ramban, in his intro to Torah, talks about how the Ribono Shalom, and it's clear in the Psukim, dictated every single letter and word to Moshe Rabbeinu. Once we accept that, why in the world would he allow changes that change the main text and meaning of the Torah to creep in? That would defeat the whole purpose. So he himself would maintain the core of the Torah. In fact, the Ashkenazim and Sephardim, it's incredible. They went through tremendous exiles in tremendously different parts of the world, and yet in our recent days have all come together with the same Torah. Yes, there might be 6 minor differences. Should it say and or? Should there be an additional letter in names or in the prefixes to names? It's unbelievable how minor the changes are, nothing to the messages of the Torah. That in of itself is incredible. The authenticity of the Torah, how it is maintained. Finally, we have Mark Twain, the famous poem, won't go through it. All things are mortal but the Jew. You look through history itself. The fact that the Jew was able to survive so many exiles and outlast all the great empires of history is in of itself testimony to something special about the Jew. So now what? We know that the body has an neshama. There's an area of ruchnius, that is the supernatural that we began with. We ourselves are a combination of physicality and spirituality, supernatural. The neshama, the Torah nourishes much like food for the body. It connects us. The mitzvahs and averos actually impact us and who we become. The Torah is our guide for life. There's a famous quote, our thoughts become our words, become our actions, become our habits, become our values, become our destiny. And the Torah is what's guiding us how to think, how to speak, how to act, to develop healthy and good habits for successful living in this world, and Eretz Hashem to be zocha to the next world. The reward itself, sometimes I have Bachram come over to me and say, I just found out that the reward for Olam Haba is we're going to be sitting in Shir with an amazing Rebbe. There's going to be no bathroom breaks. There's going to be no breakfast or lunch breaks. It's just going to be straight learning 24/7. So how do I go to the other way? How do I go to the other path? Maybe I don't want to go there. Doesn't sound too good. Don't think about that. We can't understand what it will be like in the supernatural realm. Yes, there might be mashalim and chazal for it, but the key to know is, one thing is guaranteed, as the Mishnah in Avos says, the reach, the smell outside the gates of Gan Eden, is more pleasurable than every single moment of pleasure that anyone ever experienced in the history of mankind. That means the baseball player who hit that Grand Slam home run to win the championships, to win the World Series. It means all of them, all those moments of unbelievable pleasure we can't barely even imagine. It means illegal pleasures and legal pleasures of life, having a child, the first child, unbelievable pleasures that people experience throughout the history of mankind. Put all that pleasure into one incredibly intense moment of pleasure that we can't even imagine, and that still pales in comparison to the pleasure of the smell outside the gates of Gan Eden. I don't know exactly what we'll do, but I guarantee you it will be that pleasurable, as Chazal make it clear. So it is a worthwhile endeavor, even if we just look at it from the schar va'onesh, from the reward perspective. And there's a lot that we can discuss here when it comes to understanding the system that Hashem put in place. Finally, with these steps established, all these different areas that we've shown this credibility, our belief in subsequent lifestyle becomes a matter of common sense. This belief enhances our life. It does not stifle it. We must understand that Hashem guides us with love and cares deeply about us. If we are honest with ourselves in assessing what we are capable of at any given time, we have succeeded in maintaining a special relationship with Him. This brings us the greatest sense of fulfillment, meaning real deep happiness, contentment, and meaning in life, as we help to complete the purpose of the entire universe, having a relationship with Him, the Creator of the world. Your questions are amazing. I hope that I've answered all of them, if not most of them, but I am more than happy to stay as long as you'd like me here. You all have my contact information, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, to all those watching as well, to reach out, to ask myself, Ani Maamin Foundation. There are so many great organizations way beyond me that you can reach out to with your questions. There are answers to them. To these questions, there are answers. You just have to ask the right people at the right time, and you will get those answers. And with that, I will open up to questions and answers. Thank you guys so much for participating.
Father, please tell me, help me understand who made what surrounds us, the sky and the